As a pathologist, I have been handling dead bodies for over 10 years now, but there was this one particular encounter that sent chills down my spine to the extent that I quit my job. This is my true story. The cadaver of William, the deceased whose death had sparked so much controversy, lay motionless on the table, awaiting examination. I had been tasked with finding the truth behind his demise, as his family suspected foul play. The weight of responsibility hung heavily on my shoulders, and I knew I had to approach this autopsy with utmost professionalism. I entered the room. Prepared and ready to perform the autopsy, the cadaver lay on the operating table, exactly where it was supposed to be. Taking a deep breath, I turned away to retrieve the necessary operating tools. However, as I turned back to the table, a wave of confusion washed over me. Something inexplicable happened. The body was no longer where I had left it. To my astonishment and horror, it was now standing upright next to where it had been previously placed. A wave of fear washed over me as I tried to make sense of what I was witnessing. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment I questioned my own sanity. My rational mind struggled to comprehend the sight before me. I considered the possibility that maybe this was a case of mistaken identity, where someone thought to be dead was actually alive. However, having worked with dead bodies for over a decade, I knew how to recognize the signs of death. The eyes, in particular, undergo a noticeable change in color. I looked into the eyes of the figure standing before me, and there it was. The unmistakable change in eye color that signaled he was indeed dead. I stood there, frozen and perplexed, as the man said nothing, and simply stared at me. My adrenaline surged, and without thinking, I bolted towards the door, desperate to escape the presence of this inexplicable being. I found my colleague Dan, a fellow pathologist, and told him about what I had witnessed. But instead of understanding, he looked at me as if I had lost my mind. He insisted that we go back into the room to prove that what I had seen was nothing more than a figment of my imagination. Reluctantly, I followed Dan back into the room. But to my relief, or perhaps disappointment, the standing figure was no longer there. Instead, it was lying back on the operating table, as lifeless as any other cadaver. Dan chuckled, patting my shoulder, and said, "One of these fine days, you will run mad, Tony. Slow down on whatever substance you are using." I knew I hadn't used any drugs, nor had I ever used them in my entire life. I knew what I had seen, but I also knew that convincing Dan or anyone else would be futile. So I brushed it off with a fake smile, concealing the lingering fear that had settled deep within me. Dan tried to convince me that what I had experienced was simply a result of exhaustion, triggering hallucinations. However, I couldn't shake off the feeling that this was something more than just a product of fatigue. After all, I had been working with dead bodies for over a decade and had never encountered anything like this before. It was my first paranormal encounter, something similar to a ghost operation. But that was just the beginning. The worst was yet to come. I gathered courage, and as I approached the examination table, I saw his head move to the side, and now, instead of facing up, his head was facing sideways. It happened so fast that it felt like a trick of the mind. I couldn't help but think how strange it was. It felt like a surreal twist in an already perplexing situation. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me, or perhaps there was a logical explanation that eluded me. Unable to contain my bewilderment, I mentioned the discrepancy to my co-partner, hoping for some clarity. However, he seemed puzzled by my bewildered expression. He couldn't fathom why I was behaving that way. With no answers to be found, we proceeded. As we began the meticulous examination, my mind was still plagued by the strange turn of events. I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. The room was filled with an air of tension as we meticulously examined the body, collecting samples and scrutinizing every detail. Yet, my distress lingered, casting a shadow over the proceedings. My hands were trembling, and I accidentally cut my glove with the surgical razor, necessitating a change and the donning of a new pair of gloves. As I moved away from the operating table to retrieve the fresh gloves, an inexplicable force seized me. Something, or someone, had grabbed hold of me. Yes, you are right. It was the hand of the cadaver of William, gripping my lab coat tightly. I could feel his presence, but when I turned to look at his face, you won't believe what I saw. He was now sitting upright while smiling widely, to the point I could see his teeth, his eyes staring deeply into mine. The shock overwhelmed me, and I let out a piercing scream. In a state of panic, I bolted out of the room again, my co-assistant following suit, equally bewildered by my sudden flight. I sought refuge in the hospital's waiting area, trembling with fear. Colleagues approached, concerned and curious, but I was unable to speak. My mind raced, thoughts spinning like the hands of a clock, unable to make sense of the inexplicable events that had unfolded. The experience scared me to the point where I couldn't stay alone and had to move in with a friend for a while. The nights that followed were filled with restless sleep. The encounter continued to haunt me, replaying in my mind over and over again. I couldn't understand what the figure wanted or why it had chosen me as its target. I stopped going to work, and when my management called to ask why I failed to report to work, I told them I was sick. I couldn't tell them the truth because no one would believe me. They would think that I was crazy or something of that sort. After staying at home for some time, I thought about going back to work, but I felt like I couldn't. That's when I decided to quit my job for the sake of my sanity and instead do something different where I would not deal with dead bodies or come near one. This encounter has ever since remained fresh in my mind. The question remains, if it were you, would you go back there again? Would you have the courage to confront the unknown, or would you choose to stay away, preserving your sanity and peace of mind?